Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be doing a painting inspired by this photograph that I took on the beach at Cuckmere Haven. I shall be using my artistic license to interpret it, but taking most of the basic elements that are there and translating them into watercolour. You can see that I've sketched out the beach, the breakwater, and I've grouped the people into a little sort of family grouping over on the right. So I'm going to be painting it in a similar sort of weather, early spring, late winter, with a beautiful blue sky and some clouds. My paper is Saunders Waterford cold press paper. It's 140 pounds weight, or 300 grams. It's 11 inches by 15 inches or 28 centimetres by 38 centimetres. It's taped to my board with decorator's masking tape, and my board's at an angle of about 45 degrees, so the paint will flow as I paint. Now I'm painting wet onto the dry paper today. This is cobalt blue, and now I'm using some raw sienna, and I'm just putting it across the page to start off my blue sky and cloud effects. I'm making sure I leave some of the paper unpainted or very lightly painted in order to get the lightest lights of my clouds. The brush I'm using is a synthetic mop brush or wash brush, and it's an Escoda Ultimo synthetic brush, and it's a size 14. It's really nice. It's very similar to using a squirrel mop, but of course it's synthetic hairs. It holds lots of water and lots of paint, and I can get a nice point on it too, so it's a very, very useful brush. I can use it damp to sort of soften out my sky and clouds. Watercolour will always dry back a lot lighter, and I'm thinking this might be a bit too pale, and yet at the same time my paint is beginning to dry out and it's beginning to reach that sort of danger point where I think it might be a bit difficult to paint on. If I keep trying to paint on it, it'll go muddy, and I might get run back. So I think I'm going to put on some quite heavy rich paint. This paint is drier or less watery, so it shouldn't give me the run backs. But what I'm going to do is get the heavier, richer paint on, and I'm going to use my water spray, and I'm going to re-wet the paper in that area, and then tip and tilt the board and just see if I can get a little bit more of a deeper, richer flow where the paper is beginning to dry a little bit too quickly. I've got the heating on in the studio and it's nice and warm, and so the paint is drying a bit quicker than I'd want it to. So there's that richer paint going on now, using a bamboo flat harky brush, unbranded, that I bought from AliExpress. And now that I've got that heavier, richer paint, I'll get that to flow and water spray the page. You can see it's running down, but I can tip and tilt my board and control the flow of the water that way, using gravity to help me, and just dragging the paint along. So you can now see I'm beginning to get some deeper cobalt blue hues in my sky, and all I need to do now is try and re-establish some clouds. So I'm going to do this using a combination of my 3/4 inch flat brush. You can see I'm lifting out some of the paint, washing out the brush, drying it, then lifting out a bit more. And I can use a paper towel to carefully lift out even more of these clouds, as long as I'm quick while it's still nice and damp. And I can just feather out some of these soft clouds so that my sky becomes like richly blue in places, with white clouds with the yellow sunlight just gleaming off the clouds in places and a few shadows. Every now and again I'll just turn my piece of tissue because you can see how much of the blue paint it's soaking up. I'm trying to establish those lovely clouds with those sort of silver linings, and they're just beginning to appear now. But I have to be careful not to overdo this, because if you overdo lifted clouds like this, then it can look quite, contrived, I think. Or it can look muddy, so you have to be careful and just use a very light touch. I think I'm just about there with that, so now I'll just bring that water across the horizon line and make sure that I've got some pale blue at the base of the horizon line and going into the sea. And now I'll bring some slightly richer blue into the beach, where the sea is sort of lapping up against some of the stones, and it's just wet sand as well. So this blue in the foreground is the sky reflected in the water. So next I quickly want to establish a base coat or undercoat for my beach. It's a very rocky beach, all sorts of different size. There's shingle and rocks, that sort of thing. So I'm going to suggest that using the flat harky brush again, the bamboo one, and I've picked up Paynes grey, sepia and indigo and raw sienna and burnt sienna on the brush at the same time, and I'm using the tips of the brush to quickly establish those rocks. I'm making these sort of horizontal lines, and because I've got different colours on my brush, it's building up the base for my shingle and rocky beach, with the water from the low tide sort of glinting between those patches of rocks, like in the photograph that I showed you at the beginning. Now this is a plastic store card, and I'm using the corner to scrape through the rich heavy paint, and it moves the paint to one side, creates shadows underneath and around that scraped mark, revealing the shapes which suggest rocks and stones and boulders. So I'm working across mostly the foreground, creating these etched effects into the wet paint. It can be very effective if you practice this technique. It's very useful. You can use a palette knife for this effect as well if you'd rather use that than a plastic store card. And then you can go back in with the paintbrush and establish or re-establish some colour and shadow around those rocks. Trying to make sure that I keep a sort of flat top to most of the rocks, but I vary the size, the shapes and the groupings, so it looks like random rocks just sort of poking out from the sand. Just going to make sure there are enough shadows under the rocks. So for this I shall use my 3/4 inch flat brush, which is very useful for painting rocks, but also for using the tips to create fine shadows and straighten up across the base of the rocks where they are protruding from the sandy beach. And then using the same flat brush to put in some sandy colour here and there, just to bring some light sandy areas to the beach, but without covering up all the white of the paper. And then back in with my dark sort of Paynes grey, indigo and sepia mixture to keep building up carefully the last remaining shadows in my beach. So I think I'm quite happy with that. So the next thing that I'm going to do is to begin to paint my breakwaters. Cuckmere Haven Beach has many different breakwaters leading down into the beach. I think the place sadly suffers quite a lot from coastal erosion. The seawall is almost breached again and things like that. So these breakwaters have probably been there for years, trying to sort of control the tide a bit, to no avail. But they're very interesting structures. Some of them are really tall, like these two poles here are easily taller than an adult human. And then there's some smaller ones too. So I'm using the flat brush and the dark mixture again of Paynes grey, sepia and indigo, just to put in my breakwaters going out towards the sea. There's a smaller group of smaller breakwaters which I'll paint in with my small calligraphy brush, and I can dab back if anywhere's too dark, just to add a bit of texture and tone. And then with my small calligraphy brush, put in these this breakwater that's a little bit further out to sea. Sort of smaller pilings. It's important with breakwaters like this to get the perspective right, and I made sure that I lined up my perspective correctly. If you look on the horizon, you'll see that there's a tiny little mark which is a distant ship. Now that became my vanishing point, so I drew converging lines out from the ship and made sure that my breakwaters, as they went out to sea, conformed to the principles of perspective, top and bottom, so that they recede into the distance with the correct perspective. And here I'm just adding just the indications of some reflections, pulling them down vertically from the breakwater pilings. Just a little bit of something and nothing to bed them into the beach and to show that there's water there between all the rocks at low tide. And a nice little detail, I think, for that larger piling is to use the card just to scrape through the moist paint to give a paler mark, and then bring down a fine sort of rope trailing that's been tied from the breakwater that's trailing down onto the beach. And now I can paint my family group. I'm just going to have them in silhouette as we're looking towards the sun, so they're just going to be backlit in silhouette. I'm using the darker colour, and I'm going to use my small calligraphy brush just to rough in an impression of a couple and a child standing closely together looking out to sea. You could, of course, if you're going to paint something similar, you could, of course, paint them in colourful clothes if you prefer, but I quite like just to keep my figures very simple and fairly indistinct. And then I can just pull down, similarly, some shadow or reflection in the wet beach or on the wet beach, just coming down vertically from where my figure group is standing. And I think that's finished. I could add a bit more detail to it, but I'm not going to. I considered just darkening up the sea below the horizon very slightly, but I thought that as a simple demonstration painting here, I quite like the sort of hazy, indistinct look of the horizon and just the pencil marking of that ship out to sea. So, as I always like to do, I remove the tape just so that I can have a look at it. This gives me like a sort of fresh look at it, seeing it with a clean white border. It's almost looking at it as if it was matted or mounted and framed. And yeah, I like this. I'm pleased with the way it turns out. The way it turned out, I think it really does evoke Cuckmere Haven Beach. and sort of the vast expanse of sky above the sea. And if you look closely, you can see that most of the marks are just very simply done and loosely done with the paintbrush, hopefully suggesting enough detail and with enough tonal balance and light and movement in the sky to make for an effective seascape. Well, I hope it was helpful. Please leave us a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thanks so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.